We have a strengthening, dangerous hurricane named Michael entering the Gulf of Mexico. Good evening, I'm Mike Naso from the IPR 365 YouTube page with the latest on the tropics. Of course, hurricane season goes on until November 30th, and that is the proof in the pudding right there. Hurricane Michael leaving western Cuba, strengthening. It's a strong Category 1. It is expected to become a Category 3 major hurricane prior to landfall in the next 48 hours along the Florida west coast. Here's the latest on Michael as of 10 p.m. Central, 11 p.m. Eastern. The large eye of Hurricane Michael was at 23.2 north, 85.3 west. Winds were 90 miles an hour, although it could be closer to 100. Pretty soon is probably going to cross into the Category 2 threshold. And the pressure was down to 970 millibars. That is a powerful storm. And it's moving north at 12. So it's starting to move a little bit faster, and that motion is expected to be north-northwest, north, and then eventually off to the northeast. And I'll tell you why in just a second. Making landfall sometime probably during the day Wednesday as a very dangerous major hurricane along the Florida Panhandle. I should note we do have hurricane warnings out. Alabama-Florida border to Suwannee River, Florida, and still in western Cuba. Of course, hurricane force winds are extending outward up to about 40 miles or so, and that should be leaving Cuba, but they're still under those tropical storm winds right now. The Keys are getting buffeted, but not quite to sustain tropical storm force. Nevertheless, the wind field is expanding, the system is strengthening, and it is going to slam that energy into the Florida Panhandle and the Big Bend region of Florida. Here's the latest infrared satellite imagery, and you can see the hurricane is still undergoing wind shear of about 20 knots over the top of it, and it's strengthened in spite of all of that. Michael has continued to get organized, and now that the shear is forecast to let up, and the waters over the Gulf of Mexico here in the eastern Gulf are very, very warm, that is going to allow further strengthening into a major hurricane prior to landfall. And again, we've seen many major hurricanes make landfall on the west coast of Florida in October because we get them in the Caribbean, and then we get these troughs moving across the U.S. that grab them and push them on up right into the west coast. And unfortunately, that is happening this year with Michael. It's going to cause a lot of problems, especially with storm surge flooding. I'll show you that in just a second. You can see the convection wrapping around the eye of the hurricane, and that is a harbinger of things to come. Tomorrow we're likely to see a significantly stronger hurricane than we have right now. Now, I mentioned the storm surge. It is going to be tremendous. You can see areas here, they're talking 8 to 12 feet, Indian Pass to Cedar Key, 6 to 8 feet, Cedar Key to Crystal River, the Okaloosa-Walton County line to Indian Pass, up to 9 feet perhaps. Even down in Tampa Bay, up to 4 feet of flooding. That's not good. That's not good at all. Look at how far inland this storm surge can inundate. These are areas like Apalachicola, St. Marks, Florida. Remember Hermine in 2016? That was a run-of-the-mill Category 1 that came in, and it caused a lot of flooding problems. We're going to be talking about a major hurricane, much worse than Hermine, with Michael. So if you live on these barrier islands or you had a vacation planned, I'm sorry. There's no way. I mean, the evacuations will begin, and those low-lying areas are going to have to be seriously considered a dangerous place to be, where you'll want to be in higher ground for when that storm surge comes up. Remember during Florence, the storm surge in the Outer Banks, areas like Rodanthe and all that? Remember that water pushing in, that surge? Imagine what's going to happen, especially if it's a high tide. Oh, it could be bad. Hopefully it won't be as bad as you think, but you can't risk it with a dangerous hurricane like Michael, and so we're going to watch that very carefully. Wind-wise, it's a Category 1, almost a 2. It's expected to be a 3. You can't rule out anything even as high as a Category 4 if it rapidly intensifies, so we're talking about major wind damage at the coast with a major hurricane. But look at the tropical storm force winds. By tomorrow evening, tomorrow night, already impinging on the coastline there of Alabama, Florida Panhandle, west coast of Florida. So this is not like Florence where we're going to have la-di-da 10 days to track it seesawing across the Atlantic. This is going to come in and spread right out into the Atlantic very quickly. I mean, look at this. By the weekend, it's gone. But what it leaves behind in Florida is going to be a lot of problems. At least the rainfall shouldn't be Florence-like prolific, but still 6 to 10 inches is nothing to mess around with, especially if it sits in the same area over and over again with the rain bands to the north of the storm. You could get isolated higher amounts, and that could cause some flooding. And of course, the hurricane right now has a pretty good rain rate with it. Look at that right around the center. There's some pretty good rainfall. So the convection's building, the storm's increasing in size and strength, the pressure's dropping, winds rising. Just all around bad news with Michael tonight. The models, they're going to do some synopsis missions with the aircraft flying around out there to get them into the latest models, but as of right now, they're pretty straightforward. North, north, northwest, north, and then an acceleration off to the northeast. And that's all because Michael is trapped. You have the high pressure in the western Atlantic in a clockwise flow like that, and then you have this troughiness coming right across the U.S. mid-latitude. What is that going to do? That's a northward motion followed by a northeastern turn very quickly up and out. But as of right now, Michael's kind of trapped, which is why it's been milling around Cuba, battering them, and of course, strengthening today. The intensification is worrisome. You can see this shear map. The lines here showing the red. The red is the higher shear, the green is the lower shear. So you can see it's right on the edge of low shear down here and very high wind shear to the north. And it's over 20 knots of shear right now, blowing right over the top of it, and Michael's not even batting an eye, strengthening. So it seems like the hurricane just built a good core, and it's a robust hurricane, and it's withstanding the less favorable winds more than we would like to see at this time. And as they become more favorable, that just means more strengthening. So again, a major hurricane making landfall in Florida in about 48 hours. This is serious stuff, and residents need to be on the alert now. This is nothing to play around with at all. Finally, to reiterate from the National Hurricane Center, the key messages involving Michael. Number 1, life-threatening storm surge. Florida Panhandle, Big Bend, Nature Coast. They have a storm surge warning in those areas, and residents in those areas follow the advice of your local officials. I guarantee evacuations will be taking place if they're not already, and I've heard good news of residents spending the day-to-day preparing, buying the ice, the bottled water, the batteries, the flashlights, everything you need in the event of evacuation for a major hurricane. Number 2, the hurricane warning is up, and everyone in those areas needs to be prepared for life-threatening winds associated with the core, and that will extend inland over the Panhandle, southern Georgia, southeast Alabama. Remember, the acceleration might be good for heavy rainfall, but it's bad for strong winds, because even though the hurricane is going to weaken, this is going to be a big, fat, major hurricane donut surging on in and then accelerating. So those winds will spread inland. Remember Opal in 95? Yeah. Number 3, heavy rainfall could produce life-threatening flash flooding. As I showed, you're going to get 6 to 10 inches, maybe higher amounts, so that's nothing to mess around with, but that's going to head towards areas of South Carolina already impacted by Florence, so that sucks. Number 4, hurricane conditions in western Cuba through tonight. We still have the hurricane warning out. It's been pounding western Cuba this morning, all through the day, the evening, tonight, it's just pounding it. And finally, number 5, Michael is going to produce heavy rain and flash flooding over Cuba and the Yucatan Peninsula the next couple of days. We've already seen deaths in Central America due to the flooding from Michael. So that about wraps it up right now for Hurricane Michael, a strengthening, dangerous hurricane entering the Gulf of Mexico, headed towards Florida. Hurricane warning from Alabama-Florida border to Suwannee River, as well as western Cuba. A significant wind and storm surge threat with this storm. Late season Hurricane Michael taking aim at Florida tonight.